So, what we want to do today is we want to find out the difference between COVID-19 and the global financial crisis. And in particular, we want to understand how and why these two both have stimulus all around the world, major governments doing trillions of dollars in stimulus, how and why it's happening, and what are the differences. Because I've heard people say, and it's becoming a growing chorus apparently, is that COVID-19 is sort of a test, quote unquote test, for capitalism. And I would actually argue that global financial crisis was a bigger test of capitalism than this is. This is not in the same category, which is what I want to show today, but I want to show it with the balance sheet view. So balance sheets. And how we'll start out actually is you. So here you are, you're a stick figure, you got gorgeous curly hair, male or female, it doesn't matter. And we're going to start off with your balance sheet here. And you've invented your own money, we're just going to call them units. Just going to call them that just so I don't call them dollars or anything else, just to not confuse them. They're just units of something, it doesn't matter. And there's 10 people in the society. Here we have 10 people. They have some okay hair, but not as gorgeous as yours. That's why you're the leader. There's times 10. And these people have agreed to use your money. They trust in you, etc. And this is their consolidated balance sheet. And we have resources out here. And these resources are priced in your units. So we'll just call them U. And so people obviously need units to buy these resources. So here we have U. And here at time 0, before you do anything, before you give away any of your money, these balance sheets are empty. There's nothing here. They're empty, and also what's important is there's no economic activity. Nothing's happening. Let's say you want to give away 10 of your units. What we do is we go plus 10U here. These are your assets, these are your liabilities, and these are your assets, and these are your liabilities. And the thing is, your units are just on a hard disk. Computers exist in this world, and you just put it down and you just write it in Notepad, essentially. Plus 10U. Thing is, it's a liability for you because this is something that you're giving away. Sort of quote unquote giving away. That's why it's a liability for you. However, to balance things out, these 10U, those are actually an asset for the people. See, the only way they can get these units is from you. And it's only by you willing to expand your balance sheet that people can similarly expand their balance sheet and get more units. And with these 10 units, people can buy real resources. And the other important thing to note is, you see this mistake a lot, is that people assume, if we get all these extra money, if central banks give away money or governments, that, we're all richer. Well, the thing is, no matter how many of these units you produce, real resources stay the same. Real resources do whatever they like. They're just here. The units are just what we use to account for them and to then divvy up the real resources amongst yourself and the 10 people that are willing to use it. The other important feature of having, your assets, your liabilities here, you could tax everyone. You could get tired of having plus 10U on your liability side of your balance sheet. You could tax everyone and go minus 10U, and it goes down to 0 again. And that equals literally zero debt, because these U is your debt. It's something that you owe to everyone else. But the thing is, when these go down to 0, economic activity also goes down to 0, because economic activity can only happen with your units. So this is important because this sort of gets to the heart of what happened with the global financial crisis. So I'll get into an example. So we'll forget about the 10U, forget about the 0 10U. And instead, let's say with this 10U, people get 5 plus 5 financial securities. It doesn't really matter what form these take. The main thing is that they have some sort of percentage return. And you can think about this literally. If you have cash, if you're holding cash right now, there's no return on it. And in fact, there's a negative return on it because there's inflation. So you get financial securities that have a percentage return, and most of the time you're investing in the long term. And so let's say people in your economy now get plus 5 financial securities. Well, how does this balance out? How did they acquire these? Well, what they did is they minus 5U from this side. So there's cross out 10 and we have plus 5U and plus 5 financial assets. The important thing is the total amount in the economy hasn't changed. We still got plus 10U for you on liabilities, and now we have financial securities here. Let's say a financial crisis hits your little economy. The problem with these financial securities is you're investing for the long term, but the financial crisis or any sort of crisis, regardless of what it is a short-term thing. And the thing is, these aren't as liquid. These real resources, they're priced in you. They're not priced in financial securities. You can't spend your financial securities to get real resources. And you might need real resources and you might need them today. But if a lot of your money is tied up in these financial securities, then you can't buy real resources. So everyone wants to get out. But the thing is, everyone wants to get out of these financial securities at the same time. So what's the solution so we don't get a complete collapse? They sell these to you. They sell these and they become your asset, plus 5. So these financial securities, they come to you and they're still an asset. They're an asset for you like they're an asset for the people down here. So the question is, now that these financial securities have been transferred over to you on your asset side, how do you fund them? Simple. You just credit yourself. Minus 5, so now you have plus 5U on this side, currency, and you just credit people plus 5. So what's happened was we had plus 5 previously, plus 5U. People sold their asset, you gave them plus 5U. So now we go back to plus 5, plus 10, which is what people want. On this side, you've got your financial securities and you're still minus 5 in debt on your liability side. Oh, sorry, plus 5. Plus 5. So these balance out and these balance out. And the idea is we haven't changed the overall amount of money. Despite the fact that your balance sheet on your asset side has increased because you've taken the financial securities, we haven't increased. The total amount in the economy has stayed the same. We still got plus 10 and we still got plus 10 here. And that's the point, is that you're essentially a lender of last resort. You came in, ideally people trade financial securities and the like amongst themselves and they decide how much risk they want to take on. But when a crisis hits, any sort of financial or any sort of global crisis, or just simply large enough crisis, everyone wants to get out of financial securities and everything at the same time. No one's going to buy. So who's going to buy? Well, in this case you, but in the normal case, the central bank. And that's where a central bank ultimately comes in. And the same basic story played out in the crisis. So if we have the central bank, in this case the Fed, consolidated with the government, balance sheet doesn't really matter. We have you and I, and then we have your pension fund, or basically anywhere you're just saving your money other than a bank. And what happened was, so they had securities on the side of the assets, liabilities. You are invested in funds and you have a deposit here, which is then their liability. And ideally, you're going to draw upon that when you retire, or maybe a bit earlier, depending on your circumstances. But the idea is that you have this on your balance sheet, and these companies, whatever they are, money market mutual funds, it doesn't matter, they have securities. But the problem is when the global financial crisis hit, everyone wanted to sell these securities at the same time and they wanted to go into money. And in this case, what's the best money in the world? Well, it's the USD. United States dollar, because it's a world reserve currency. As you will have found out if you're in Australia and you're trying to buy something overseas, it's usually priced in USD, which is a pain in the ass, obviously, because our dollar is not particularly strong against the USD, so it costs you extra money. These securities, everyone wanted to sell, but who wanted to buy? No one. So instead, they just ended up here. On the central bank balance sheet, which ballooned out to like 3 trillion or something? Something like that. 3 trillion, the Fed, during the financial crisis, and it issued a bunch of reserves. We'll go into that later, that doesn't matter right now. The important thing is, all these securities were traded for all of the money that was created, I don't know, roughly 3 trillion. So the overall amount of money, because the private sector lost securities and gained the exact same amount in dollars, in USD, the overall amount of money didn't change in the economy. It was just an asset swap. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing that the balance sheet ballooned for the central bank, and it might be a while before we see the negative effects of that. But in terms of the financial crisis, the reason we didn't get hyperinflation, as many buffoons were predicting, or in fact we didn't really get a huge uptick in inflation either, is because it wasn't a net, it wasn't a net increase of assets. It's not that people had these securities and then got 3 extra trillion, is that they minus securities and got 3 trillion. So the point of what people call quantitative easing is that it also equals large scale asset purchases. So it implies that the central bank normally makes asset purchases and it sells and purchases assets, but this is on a large scale. That's the main difference between QE and normal operations, and that's why it wasn't inflationary. It was just doing things it normally does, but it does it on a larger scale. It was not a net increase of assets into the economy. And the thing is, and this is the same with the RBA, which also did quantitative easing and is doing quantitative easing now. The thing is, the RBA and the Fed and all that, they can only work through the financial system. So that's why you get this idea that with the global financial crisis, that it was a test of capitalism, because it was the banks got bailed out, ultimately. It was the big banks, it was big investment firms, I'm pretty sure hedge funds as well, all that kind of jazz. It's all the big financial stuff, because the big banks, the RBA, the Fed and all that, they can only work through the financial system. It's something that we've set up. It's a framework that we've set up for them. It's a legal thing that they can only work through the financial system. And then they can sort of hope, I don't like this term, but let's say trickle down. Gives a bit of the wrong impression, but in this case, I think it's an okay term. Trickle down from there into what they call Main Street. Now, the only way for you and I to get directly affected, to get money and stuff, is through the government. So what was happening during the financial crisis is governments were very, very slow to react. It was only really in Australia and a few other places that there was large stimulus efforts by the government. And so if you remember during that time, if you're in Australia, through Centrelink, they issued checks to people, or you just got deposited, I think it was $750 first round to a whole lot of people. Centrelink, this was a stimulus to you and I, and then I think it was another $750 after. But the thing is, the government must step in to help you and I. Government can only help you and I, and the central banks can only help the financial system. And so that's why, because the governments were slow to react during the global financial crisis, you and I didn't get much help, other than unless you're in Australia. Everywhere else, the governments were really slow to react, and so you and I, the majority of the people, didn't feel much of an effect, didn't get much of a benefit. Only the banks did, and that's why it was considered sort of a test of capitalism. It was helping the rich at the expense of poor. But what's happening now with COVID is something completely different. So what we have now is we have central banks / government, and basically we have a consolidated balance sheet now. They're no longer separate entities, and they're working together. And that's why they're cutting checks, they're giving stimulus money, not only to businesses, but to you and I, in most places around the world. And so that's the sense in which the COVID-19 is different. Because businesses and the like have been forced to shut down, so because we're forcing activity to go down, we're also losing all the benefits of all those businesses, and we're also losing the workers, you and I. We can't go to work, so we also obviously lose our salary, etc. Just pay in general. And because of that, businesses and you and I are getting money right now. So the reason I think that all of these trillions of dollars that's happening around the world won't be inflationary, I'll just draw something quickly. So basically we were on a path like this for growth, resource usage, etc., COVID-19 hits and we go down like this. Pretty sharp. You know, this is space of like 2 weeks or something. 2 weeks. The idea is that if governments around the world hadn't stepped in, or some theoretical point here, hadn't stepped in, we might get what's called a V-shaped recovery, and we might go back up like this. The idea is if we hadn't done this, there's a theoretical line that goes down to here, and this might be the Great Depression or even worse. Great Depression. Or even worse. And it might take a lot longer. You know, this could be decades before we get up to this trend line. So what you can imagine is we have the actual growth and we have a trend line here. And the idea is that we want to return to here. How do we do that? Well, lots of money and other targeted programs. And the idea is that activity picks back up. The point is that we have a loss of activity on this side. There's a lot of things we lose on here. We want to gain them back on this side. But remember what I said about the financial assets. The financial assets, when the private sector sold financial assets and financial securities in general to the central bank bought them up, the net amount of money in the system was the same. You sold your financial assets, and you gained the same amount in money. The idea is that this is the same. We lose activity, lose money, and liquidity and all that dries up. The idea is that it pushes it back up. The idea is that we just get back, or as close as we can to this line. We may never reach it again. There might be a permanent output gap. The idea is we get up here. We don't overshoot. We don't go up like that. That is where we get inflation. That is where this is real resources in the economy. And that is where a lot of money chases too few goods and we get hyperinflation or just great amounts of inflation, all that kind of jazz. The idea is we get down to this point, it pushes us back up. We want to minimize this. This is an output gap. And so that's the point. That's the sense in which I do not believe all this money, even though it's trillions of dollars around the world, will not be inflationary. All this money will be paid back by the activity here. But the idea is that this activity is not net activity. It's just returning us back to the activity that would have been. There's all this activity here, that activity dries up, and we just get back to the same amount of activity. That is the sense in which COVID is different to the global financial crisis, and why I don't think it's a test of capitalism. It's because we're forcing activity to go down. It's not that activity is going down due to something fundamentally wrong with the economy. Actually, as an addendum to my video, what I thought I'd do is actually show the statement of liabilities and assets for the actual Reserve Bank of Australia. I don't know why liabilities is on this side of the sheet. It should be on this side, but here we have liabilities, here we have assets. Like I was saying, the total 277,680, 277,680. The other thing is they've got in here, in particular, they've got movement since previous Wednesday, 16,879, and on liabilities and on the assets, sorry. You can see here the liabilities, Australian notes on issue. So this is the amount of notes, physical cash that we've been issued, and as you can see, it's a liability of the RBA, just like it is in the example that I gave. As this is the actual RBA, this is more complex than what I showed, and so long as Australian money, Australian dollar is a thing, this is a permanent liability of the RBA. And the same thing with the example that I gave of you, is that with the units, those units are a permanent liability of you, so long as your institution is in place and so long as people continue to use it. So yeah, thank you for watching. Subscribe, rate and share all the good stuff. Definitely helps my channel, and I'll see you guys next time.